Welcome back to another episode of Coaches Exploring Clarity. And this week, we've got another special guest, Abby Krishnan from Singapore, joining us 12 hours ahead of me, where I am in Canada. So she can, enlighten us from the future on what's going on. But today we're going to be exploring chapter 23 in Clarity, and that's the art of sustainable change. And it starts out with a quote from Peter Drucker, management consultant and writer. And the quote is, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." And then it moves into another quote, which I'll just read just because it really struck me at how applicable it is. And that'll make sense in a second. But it's a quote from a speech that Charlie Chaplin gave in a movie, The Great Dictator from 1940. It says, "We have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives abundance has left us in want. Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness." And again, the thing that struck me with that is that that's from 1940. And, it literally could have been written in 2023. As particularly, I think about the last 12 months anyway, with AI and things like, and it just made me think, the more things change, the more they stay the same, regardless of where you are on a technological advancement scale, these kinds of issues kind of rear their head. So that's the first thing that jumped out at me.
Yeah, and that quote, there's just one thing jumped out at me. We think too much and feel too little. Well, it's kind of like, well, no harm necessarily in thinking. Kind of, to me, it sort of struck me, it sort of depends where your thinking is directed. That is kind of more appropriate than, thinking's okay sometimes.
Yeah, for sure.
Actually, what this reminded me of, the fact that it's Charlie Chaplin in 1940, is when we were chatting a few weeks ago about our ancestors, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and how insightful they were and the wisdom that they drew upon, regardless of what the knowledge they had at the time. That everything that they saw, they dealt with, they handled, and regardless of technology or what was going on around them. This whole, just back to 1940, and this was the wisdom then, just struck me that, and it goes on leads me on to the next page, that what we have, we've always had this what we have inside, we've always had, and regardless of time or century or but what a beautiful quote. I had heard that a very long time ago, and actually when I first read the book, skipped over it. Interestingly, I kind of went, oh yeah, but it didn't. So to go to Abby's point of kind of really delving in here, what things say to us when we pay attention. That's what struck me.
Greg, what you said, the more things change, the more they stay the same. That's exactly what hit me as well when I looked at it. And, Lynne, when we go deeper into what Charlie Chaplin was talking about and what the 1950s, 40s had, I mean, there was no telephone, no internet, none of the information overload that we have today, none of the technological advances that we are blessed to have today. And yet the feeling that existed and the sense of stress that surely he's referring to, with the cynicism and the cleverness and the machinery leaving people in want. I mean, that human condition and that misunderstanding of how the world operates has existed back then too. And here we are, 70, 80, 90 years, nearly a century, in another 15 years since that quote. And we're sitting in the same position where we could literally say the same thing about what's happening today with the advent of AI, with how people feel about jobs and livelihoods and what's coming up next, with deficit of attention as we see from internet and social media and what that means, and so much being spoken about the lack of being present in the moment and understanding where the source lies. It just reads really true. So I find it's such an apt quote for talking about sustainable change, because some things truly are universal, including the underpinnings of clarity and the understanding of how we're creating the experience of our reality moment to moment. So I mean, to me, this beginning is the perfect beginning for talking about sustainable change and what that means and how do you approach it.
I agree. What I picked up on, Abby, from what you said is, it doesn't matter if the outside misunderstanding is rooted in, newspapers and horses and buggies or smartphones and AI. Like, outside in is outside in, no matter what century you're in. And just seeing how prevailing that was then, and then recognizing like how prevailing it is today, and the opportunity that presents for us as coaches, but humanity in general, to figure that out.
I'm intrigued as to why. Let me see what I want to say about that. Why Jamie put these two quotes together? Because if you go to the start, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and then go into that, it's absolutely intriguing to me. How did he even come up with that? Because they are, well, again, they're time apart, but
yeah.
To go to the depth of that, this from 5 words to this beautiful quote, it's
maybe we should invite
it's
Jamie to join us for our final episode, and we can
we'll ask all our favorite questions.
Yeah, put him through the ringer on like what did you mean here, or why did you do this, or what does this mean?
Okay, I'm gonna ask that one.
Yeah.
That's my question.
Yeah, it would be brilliant to have a reflection session right at the end with Jamie to just nicely wrap this up, right? Because this quote, super relevant for me. As some of you know, I come from an organizational coaching and human resources background. So in the work that I do, the importance of culture as primary to driving sustainable performance and sustainable change in the organization, that is a truth I stumbled on about a decade ago. And again in multiple organizations, I have seen that reality lived out so clearly, that if people don't, culture is simply the stories we tell each other, right? And if people are telling stories that aren't helpful, and stories that aren't productive, and stories that aren't building the relationships, strengthening the connections, and aligning people towards inspired action, there's very little that a business plan by itself can accomplish. And it's just, it's vectorizing the energy that exists in the organization, right? And that's really what culture does, is it gives direction to that energy and that potential, and drives it towards something that's sustained and tangible, and results in an impact far greater than a plan on a page can give us.
Yeah, I love that, Abby, because it really points to the fact that anything that is a plan on a page is fixed and stable, and has no potential for movement or a dynamic sort of collaboration or a dynamic anything really. And without the human, even connected component, the strategy, the business plan becomes useless.
Yeah.
It reminds me, in my corporate career, my experience had been, the executive level of their organization loved talking about culture and trying to build culture when times were good. And then in times of crises or downturns in the market and whatever, they kind of forget that that's the high leverage point, and they move into strategies and they forget about their people, and they make, terrible decisions and treat people poorly, and they suffer the consequences. And it's, I think it's kind of the same overall with recognizing the power of clarity and being in a clear state of mind. It's in those crises is when it's the most valuable, not when you throw that out the window and try to do it the other way, because I don't have time to get a clear mind or, think about things that way. So it creates quite a paradox, I think, in people's lives, but in corporate institutions for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's also something about the idea of culture that, and I know some organizations do indeed deal with, let's say, a cross-cultural communication sort of thing. But like the culture is within each and every one of us. It's not across the culture or across the nation or across the different countries. So, and the very fact that there is actually an organization that deals with it, let's say, implies the notion that there's something different between the cultures.
Mm.
It is diametrically opposite to what, again, connectedness and clarity would be pointing to. So even the very attempt to approach something like a cross-cultural situation it's sort of a non-starter. If it's already working on a problem that really doesn't need to be addressed at all, if you address it from clarity.
Yeah, that's really got me thinking. When we go back and look at the data behind it, while statistically the means or the medians of some of that data can point to some things, what every researcher has acknowledged is that if you look at the spread of the data, the individual variability is far higher than whatever the statistical mean or median is telling you. So theoretically, yes, it's useful. As a story, it's an interesting or somewhat useful, like carrying the map, right? Somewhat useful guide to carry. But if you mistake the map for the territory, then you're in a very difficult land, because all it does is it guides some questions that you might ask or ways in which you could check your understanding. But going back to the principles of clarity really helps you figure out what is the best way to form a connection with the human being in front of me, who is the territory and not the map.
Yeah, I love that distinction.
Yeah.
Yeah, we the way you've put that is like I'm getting flooded with like experiences or memories of being treated like a map and not like the territory. Like it's that it's that's the the impersonal kind of treatment of an employee versus treating them like a human being, like, and having that connection with them. It's interesting.
And it is the failure point of most diversity initiatives today. It's exactly that.
Yeah, I see that, where it's almost like they treat, in the effort to make a difference and include people, they just lump them in another monolithic block and don't treat them like actual human beings. Yeah, it's a bit of a trap, I think, that they fall into. Anyway, the next part here on 248 is like a whole page of the caterpillar metaphor. which I think is probably one of the earliest metaphors I heard from Jamie. And every time I hear it, it kind of I don't know, resonates and resparks kind of that feeling of metamorphosis and reminder that, it's already there within each of us, the blueprint for what it is that we're to become.
Yeah, it isn't. It's a lovely reminder. Because the wonderful thing about when you think things, you forget them. A wonderful reminder that, like, the caterpillar can become a beautiful butterfly, and there is not one single thought that is crossed, because I don't even think a caterpillar has a brain. So I mean, and it's done all that amazing stuff without one single thought, and really points to sort of how, indeed, how we always at some point, however far up, the day that I'll let you know the day that I become Buddha or Guru or Krishna or anybody, if you like, because it just won't happen, until I have a brain in my head. And we're always misguided by one single thing, which is thought in the terms of thinking, not the thought, the creative power behind the thinking, is what I mean. And that's really, I think that's quite startling if you think about it. And it's the very same thing that keeps us from spiraling up to our beautifulness, if you like, to that, let's say, Guru or Krishna or Buddha status kind of thing. Every time, every single time.
What struck me, what you said there, Elaine, was, and I'm just thinking, how beautiful is that such amazing, to go back to the word transformation, such amazing transformation does happen without any thought whatsoever. That's just, that's a bit mind-boggling.
It makes sense out of, the Nike ad, Yoda, of course, there is no trying, just do it.
Or do not. Yeah.
Yeah, do or do not.
Yeah.
Well, last week we were talking about Star Trek. Now you've invoked Star Wars, so I appreciate it.
I knew you would, Greg.
Yeah, I had a very ridiculous thought when you brought up that example, Elaine, which was, to date, I've never heard of a caterpillar that has been stuck on the decision of whether to transform to a butterfly or not, and decided, you know what, I'm just not going to do this because it's too risky and I don't know what's on the other side of this.
That's like scary.
Exactly. So, well, that hasn't happened. So clearly, when nature is not interfered with, growth just happens. And growth is the default of nature. And transformations, whether it's from a seed to a tree, or it's from a caterpillar to a butterfly, they happen, and they happen organically. They happen when the system is ready. And there just doesn't seem to be a whole lot of rational decision-making involved in how that happens. So I just found it fascinating that somehow we tend to forget that when it comes to our circumstances and our lives and what's next for us.
Yeah. Or I'm just thinking from that, if there is some, let's use the word as you did, rational sort of process that goes on, it is indeed wisdom inspired. Like, let's say a tree will, if you want to look at it, like, might think, if it could, rationally, well, I'm going to have to put down a few roots here because, like on this hillside kind of thing, there's a lot of soil and I'm going to get some minerals and I might get some water as well. So I think this is going to be a much better place for me rather than heading off to the city where I might end up in somebody's fireplace kind of thing. So there is kind of a rational thing, but again, it's inspired by wisdom, if you like.
Yeah.
Which again, we more often than not do very rarely. We're very rarely inspired to move, especially if it's something in the future that we don't know what's going to happen. Like, oh my goodness, can I turn into a caterpillar now? Can I turn into a butterfly now? Like, we kind of say, oh my goodness, what am I going to do now? But I have to be a cat, I have to be a butterfly. Like the butterfly just, if there's any thinking going, I'll think, wow, I'm going to be very beautiful and I'm going to create a few little baby ones again, or so the whole thing will keep on going. Like, just makes sense, it makes sense that way. And we seem to recycle nonsense in our human mind. Continual recycling of nonsense.
It's funny for me because this metaphor comes to mind frequently when I'm out for a walk or whatever. If I see a butterfly or even like other aspects of nature, like in the spring is a good example when everything's kind of blossoming and stuff, or just a reminder of that, the wisdom and intelligence behind life, and it's already there, and the effortlessness and the ease at which you can become what you're intended to become without grinding away at it. I don't know. For me, anyway, it's those constant reminders of just instances in my life where you see something, it just adds to the relaxation and reminders to not get caught up in my thinking about making stuff happen. And as a person who's like, known for in default setting to action, letting that be is kind of a recent insight for me that's really been helpful.
Yeah, the big one that I also take away from this is, the concept of time, right? There's such an unhelpful relationship, if you will, that many people have with time, with how much of it is available and how much of it is required to drive towards the things that they need to go towards. And what I have found in my experience, and I believe that's what Jamie's also pointing to with the metamorphosis, is at the right time, things move and change, realizations happen. You develop the next level of understanding, the right level of understanding to help you solve whatever it is that you're facing in your life. And it happens when you stop fighting what's going on. It happens when you stop grasping and searching and holding on to things. So I just find reflecting on the notion of time and our relationship with time and how we perceive it in our lives is a really interesting place to fall deeper into a sense of clarity.
It's also one of the things on page 253, that's jumping forward a little bit, that Jamie puts in the box, and it's the top one, if you like, the inside are the three formless principles, on outside everything else, and the first on the list is time, space, and matter. Yeah, well said, Abby.
From what you're saying, Abby, I'm reminded of, in my upbringing, my parents were Salvation Army ministers, so very Christian focused upbringing. And as a kid, I used to think they were crazy about their faith in God, and things will take care of themselves and not to worry about things like this just unwavering faith in what they believed in. And now, like, I'm seeing lots of parallels, obviously, because we're all talking about the same thing, regardless of the label you put on it. But the infinite wisdom and intelligence of life guiding us and taking care of and doing the heavy lifting. And I'm seeing I'm looking back through my, those early years of my life where I used to think, like, what the hell are they talking about? To going, oh, I kind of get it now. Like, it's quite interesting, and I don't know. I don't even know what word. It just like seeing things with new eyes now is probably the best way to describe it.
And Greg, perhaps even those experiences were, the ground that was preparing you for where you are right now.
Yeah.
Because somehow you've found this path in, right? And this is making sense to you, but things make sense to us when we're ready to receive them. So somewhere there's a preparatory path, because similar to what you're saying, I grew up in the traditions of the Advaita Vedanta, which also the unitary philosophical thought behind it is the single consciousness or the formless energy that gives form to everything, and the form that's taken is illusory. And when that form dissolves, it goes back into the formless. That's very much the philosophical underpinnings that I was exposed to, because my grandparents were very learned, and they spent a lot of time with those philosophical texts. And I never thought I would stumble my way into this later in my life from a completely different direction, and find the clarity principles connecting me back to what my own background and culture had shown me, and to what the yogis talk about in terms of the underpinnings of the yoga practices that we have. So it's interesting how many of these journeys start to connect up and make sense at a later point, but it's hard to see that until you get to that point.
Yeah, I love that. Kind of a good segue into the separate realities part of this chapter too. That we, this has been a big insight for me, is realizing separate realities for myself, but also for those around me, clients and family, especially. That when we're in conflict, or my dad was over the other day and we're butting heads a little bit about stuff, and I don't know, I just, instead of like digging my heels in and like, the way we used to love debating each other on stuff, it's the realization of separate realities, and realizing, well, there's something here for me to understand about his reality, and it's not for me to convince him that my reality is reality. Like, I recognize that my reality isn't the reality. It's been very, very powerful for me.
Kind of, I'm not actually sure if what I say is sort of correct, isn't even the right word, but I suppose in some sense it turns around Descartes' idea that, is it Descartes? God, I'm hopeless with this. My reference is really poor. But the idea, was cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. It turns the whole thing right upside down, because the idea is you are, and therefore you think. And I don't know what any other philosophers of the time would think about that, but it just kind of struck me there. in the idea of, well, because of separate realities, because indeed we are, we're each our own, perhaps even we're not even the map and then the territory, but we're all a bit of all of it. We're all a bit of map and we're all a bit of territory, but each of it is, even perhaps if we should draw ourselves a map, it would be different from somebody else's. And likewise the territory, of course.
There's two things
Rather
here
like,
that
sorry, go ahead.
there's two things here that really, really hit home for me. This really gaining an understanding of separate realities. One is what you spoke about in terms of psychological innocence and understanding that people are doing the best they can and making choices that make sense to them from their current level of understanding. But even more powerful than that is the true embodied understanding of separate realities drives for me the space from which I can be curious. Because when I understand that where you're coming from and where I'm coming from are not the same place, then I have a lot more questions about where you're coming from and what your world looks like and how do you make sense of things in that world and why does it work the way it does in your view of things. And that's a far more productive space, not just for making a connection with somebody, but as change workers and as coaches and as people who are looking to help and guide others. It's also the space where we can start to perhaps get a sense or create the conditions for transformation to happen. So to me, this understanding of separate realities is really amazing in personal life, but massively applicable professionally as well.
Kind of tying me up, to Jamie's concept of getting on the raft with somebody and then taking them to the edge of the raft. The reality that the separate part is at the edge of the raft. And the power in being able to see that in somebody else as a change worker, to be able to then point them into a direction that would be more useful for them is huge.
Yeah.
It really is. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great reminder, sort of the curiosity part about, because I know for myself when I'm coaching people, I often get confused between, am I looking at their map or my map right now? And it's so easy to fall back into your own version of things. So, when you realize the separate realities component of it, there's just so much to learn. Like if you use the metaphor of the map, it's like literally every square inch of that map you could explore with them and ask them about it. And, what does this mean? Like, there's a symbol here. What does this mean? Because in my world, it means this, but for you, what does that mean? So just that, it's kind of like the underpinnings of curiosity is the realization of separate realities. Elaine, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I've forgotten what that was now. It's okay. I was all the way in there. It doesn't matter. I can't remember.
Yeah, it's that something, and I don't know exactly what you said there, Greg. It made me think about, as you investigate and check out your symbol versus somebody else's symbol, or what does that mean to you? And like, oh, well, this means something else for me. It's sort of from the one side, like the huge the potential of change work and the work that we do, but also how the work that we do, in the sense that you're saying, Greg, about getting really, really, really into an in-depth conversation, understanding somebody else, automatically sort of implies that at the same time that you create the connection with somebody to be able to help them with their insights and thought processes even, it sort of shoots right back to you, because at the same time they create their own connection, which then they take out into connecting with somebody else, because what they need, you give them, but then they take what they get and go and give it to somebody else. It's automatic. So like it's just a continual, it's this expanding web of connection. And again, the idea as well that, you know, coaching is never a one-way thing. It's not a directive thing. It's not a, oh, you've got this problem, well, we'll have a look at that then. It's just these two bodies going along together. But they're two bodies that, as they go along, like let's say the coach on one side connects to more people, but also the coachee at the same time is able to connect, because of their new understanding, to even more people and be understood, and then likewise allow somebody else to be understood and further create. It really is huge, this idea of a sort of a unison of separate realities. But nobody says that one reality is right or wrong, but you know, it's kind of a paradox in itself as well, where the separation actually comes together and stays separate. Love it.
I just had an image there of the pebble in the pond. That's what came up for me. Yeah.
The next section in the chapter is the network effect, and I think you just basically described it.
Thanks, Elaine.
Yeah, beautifully. And it's funny because when you were describing like the coaching part of it, and then thinking about like, you know, like in my own life, like the implications of me being on this journey with you guys and with Jamie, is that there's been a spillover effect with my wife and my kids, my dad, and, you know, other people that are in my circle or in my life. Similarly, I can imagine the people that we each work with as clients, when they go through transformations or have insights, and I don't know if this, you know, goes back to the kind of the butterfly effect, since we were talking about butterflies earlier, but, you know, and what you just described, Elaine, is the pebble in the pond, but there's, you know, there's so much potential impact from one conversation or one insight that could affect literally thousands of people. You know, Abby's working in organizations, like you could work with one leader, and next thing you know, there's literally thousands of people impacted by one insight that person has. So it's, I don't know, gives me goosebumps kind of thinking about it.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a client of mine who's been totally fascinated by basically everything that Jamie does, and he's now reading the book, and I've pointed him in the direction of this very thing that we're doing.
Mm.
And right at the beginning, it was sort of his kind of big revelation was, at the time, he said, oh, you know, I get this. I just do not want to be in this job anymore. There's a huge organization. It's a multinational company, engineering company. And he said, they just don't understand anything. They just have not got it. And there's just, so I want to do what you're doing, Elaine. I want to do some coaching with people. I just don't want to be in this job anymore, blah, 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 blah. As you can imagine, I mean, sensibly so. He didn't just hand in his notice like on the next day, very sensibly. Thank God for that. Because we just had a conversation this morning. He's still in the job, loving it. And he's got a new contract right now, which he's not quite so happy about. He's flitting about all over Europe for one thing and another, and the various subsidiaries and kind of thing. But he's now, what he's doing now, which I think is just awesome, he's trying to work out how he can bring the work that he's doing into the very company that he so, spoke so badly about, which I think is just awesome.
Mm.
I mean, it's that sort of transformation. We had one little transformation, which kind of, not bad, okay, good, you've made some decisions. But then, just to take the whole thing back to where he's come from a different level, of course, the spiral goes up, I think is just tremendous. How's that? The leadership, if you like.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
This is such an exciting thought. Jamie talks about his vision for a world where there's a generation of children who've grown up with this implicit understanding. And when I think about organizations, I think about leaders who are operating from this implicit understanding. And again, geeky sidebar, current research shows that narcissistic and psychopathic tendencies or traits are way higher in leadership populations than in the general population. Now, that's an alarming piece of research data that's coming at us. And for me, I kind of, when I look at people like me who are sitting on the cusp, both on the inside of organizations as well as exploring and operating less often than I'd like, more often than I used to from this understanding, I genuinely see an amazing potential because leaders have an outsized impact, whether they want to or not, whether they like it or not, and whether we like it or not. And if that impact could be for the positive and it could come from this space of, innate clarity and compassion and an understanding of the psychological innocence of people, and an ability to have a clear mind in crisis, with an inside-out thinking on how performance is created and the space from which performance happens. My God, the amount of time that we spend on conflict resolution trainings and influence trainings and whatnot, we wouldn't need any of that. We wouldn't need so many, again, outside-in programs on well-being, because what we're trying to do is load more and more when what we actually need is less.
Yeah.
Yep.
Everything you just described there reminded me of a conversation Lynne and I were having with a group yesterday about upstream and downstream, like conflict resolution, like all those things that you just described are so downstream, dealing with symptoms.
Yes.
It's and that's where a lot of time, money, and effort is focused, but it's not getting to the root of the problem. Looked like you were going to say something, Lynne.
No, it's astonishing to me because it's 20-something years now since I was in Abby's world, when I was in organization and cultural change. And it's astonishing to me still looking and noticing that it looks the same to me, that it's astonishing they're taking the same approaches, there's the same thinking. It is separate. There is a program, a group of people trying to do something to another group of people. It's astonishing to me. So if one leader, two leaders, five leaders, let's not care how many it is, just let's get to them, because it's a waste of time, waste of money, waste of effort. And it's so disparaging to everybody in that organization to not recognize that, they're part of something, they're worthy, they have value, they have wisdom of their own. They don't have to be told everything. It's just mind-boggling. It distresses me from time to time, but that's a whole other thing. So downstream, upstream.
On 252, I highlighted this whole section, which I'll read. So, what would your company, organization, or community be like if everyone in it had an insightful understanding of the principles behind clarity? What would your world be like if everyone you knew had an insightful understanding of the inside-out nature of life? How would they behave If they already felt good in themselves and about themselves, how would they act if they were guided more by wisdom than by contaminated thinking? And then it goes on and then says, we have good reason to be hopeful. But yeah, I often have wondered that about the places I've worked in my career. What if it could have been like that?
Yeah, and what I ask myself is, what if it could have been like that, and what if I can be more like that? Because that is the starting point, right? And it's the fundamental bedrock of influence. You influence through who you are and how you show up, and not through what you say. And therefore, the idea of bringing this back into the corporate world for me is much more about Elaine, people like your client, who has decided to stay in the game and operate differently. That's really where hope lies. Is more and more of corporate gardeners rather than corporate warriors. Just changing that metaphor, right? And moving from a control and attack paradigm to much more of a nurture and grow and thrive paradigm. That's, to me, the holy grail on how organizations can be much more humane places to work. And Lynne, there are some good things happening. We've got the ESG that is
I know.
defying corporate citizenship into very concrete results, right? And for me, honestly, that has been the biggest achievement that has happened over a period of time, because the reward systems are changing. And once the reward systems change, people's orientation is starting to change. And therefore, the momentum for helping people look in this direction and look upstream and look at cause, the momentum is higher, the resistance is lower. And I just find that there's a lot more receptivity, especially post-COVID as well, which has changed the equation from lead despite being not a great example of a human being, to performance is a ticket to the stadium, but if you really want to be a leader, it's about who you are and how you show up, and that matters. I think a lot more organizations today are in that mind frame, and some people just don't know how to get there, which is, I guess, where we come in, and where we have an opportunity to really help expand this understanding. And therefore, I think Jamie's book has come out at the right time, to really capture a need that I see a lot more. Mid-career professionals waking up and really asking themselves, is this all there is? I mean, why do I come into work? What's my purpose? How am I making impact? How is this meaningful? And why am I doing what I'm doing beyond the paycheck every month? I find a lot more people asking that question today than even 3 years ago. So I count that as a massive jump forward, and perhaps one of the silver linings coming out of the very difficult times that the world has been in over the last 3 odd years.
That is hopeful.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about, back to you, Greg, saying how you have changed over the past couple of years and how it's had an impact in your family with your dad, your wife, your kids. So there we are. Your kids are that next generation. What are they going to go off and do? What is their attitude going to be? How are they going to approach things? Because for sure there's going to be a difference there. If that's what they have seen, there will be a different approach, a different viewpoint, a different thinking, and that's that builds upon that ripple and sends it forward.
I did a Facebook post the other day that about my son. He came down in the morning And the first things he said, "Good morning." They said, "Hey, Dad, I had an insight last night," and I was just like, a the fact that he's using that language and like recognizing kind of what it is, and B, the fact that we have a relationship that we can talk about that. Like, I'm sure as a kid I had all kinds of insights, and I say kid, he's 17 now, but so he's almost an adult. But it certainly wouldn't have been a conversation I would have been having with my dad at 17. So.
Mm.
Just looking at the clock, maybe I thought I'd maybe read the very last paragraph in the chapter, and then we jump into the thought experiment, if that makes sense. So in this last paragraph, I think is I don't know, very profound, but see if you agree. Above all, remember this: we're all humans. We each have our ups and downs. Our experience of reality is being created from the inside out using the principles of mind, consciousness, and thought. And while we don't get to choose the time scale, new realizations can show up in any moment. And when fresh realizations arrive, our world changes. And then the thought experiment says, what if there's a bigger picture here? Many forward-thinking leaders believe that we're in the midst of a profound societal transformation. Could the fact that you're reading this book mean that you're an integral part of the societal DNA for what's to come? I think the conversation we just had would be an affirmative.
Yeah.
Damn right.
Yeah.
I think Abby just about summed up both those things, both about the time scale, if you like. You don't get to choose the time scale. And, the change that you've noticed, however, from that sounds to me like we discussed in a couple of chapters ago, the main shift, the main paradigm shift. That sounds like what you said, Abby, it sounds like beautiful evidence of people living in a shift. You said it's appearing. People are thinking about, well-being and in the office place or in the workspace and this kind of thing more. They're more open to, so, and that is kind of hopeful, which I guess is the very reason that the four of us have connected here today, for something that is hopeful.
Yeah, I definitely believe we're in the middle of a shift. And again, going even beyond the principles of clarity and the three principles world, if we go and look at the philosophical underpinnings of many of the philosophies and spiritual practices that are having a revival today, whether it is Byron Katie's work or much of what we hear in Buddhism or Advaita Vedanta or any of those disciplines, and I'm familiar with those more, but so many more that I hear about seem to have the very same universal truths at the bottom. But more importantly, I think there's also a profound shift happening in the way in which it's being received and transmitted, which is much more organic, person to person, community to community, rather than organized back into the outside in hierarchical structures that brought in rituals and bureaucracy and rigidity of thought in the past. So for me, that organic form of awakening is actually the biggest positive and sign of not just a societal transformation, but that this time that societal transformation is happening in a way which is going to be very difficult to control, manipulate, and shut down. So that I find to be a very interesting, it's certainly my reality, and I am very cognizant we all live in separate realities, but this is what I am seeing.
Yeah.
And it's also, it sounds to me, something that AI can never replicate. So we're pretty safe in our jobs.
Yeah. What I heard from what Abby was saying, it's to use kind of organizational jargon, this shift is going to be a more of a bottom up shift than a top down shift, because whether it's the ability, the fact that the four of us can do this recording and put it on the internet, and I know maybe 20 people will watch it, but it has the potential of being watched by millions. The groundswell of a movement or of enlightenment or of a paradigm shift can come from the masses, kind of bottom up, versus being fed what the hierarchies of the world want, and so on. So yeah, it's a very interesting time for sure. All right, well, why don't we leave it there? And just want to thank Abby for joining us. It's like every episode, it's been a blast, and we've enjoyed having you join us. And look forward to seeing everyone next week.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Abby. Thank you, everyone.